The first cut into the earth was an act of faith. Elias drove the spade's sharpened edge into the high meadow's sod, the ground hard with the memory of the last frost and the promise of the next. It was late summer, a time for harvesting, for salting meat and stacking wood, but he was digging a hole, a very large hole. His dog, a shepherd mix with intelligent amber eyes and a coat the color of dried grass, watched from the shade of a lone pine. Barrow whined softly, a low note of confusion in the otherwise quiet air. The scent of turned soil, rich and dark, rose in the afternoon heat. Elias worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm that belied the urgency humming beneath his skin. Shovel, lift, turn, toss. The pile of dark earth grew beside a trench that was, for now, just a shallow scar on the land his parents had left him. He had been alone for a year. The silence of the cabin was a physical weight, the emptiness of his mother's rocking chair a constant ache. All he had left were the land, the dog, and his grandfather's journals. The journals were filled with a spidery script, strange diagrams of air currents and thermal mass, and calculations based on the sun's low winter arc. His grandfather had been a man of odd ideas, a quiet scholar who saw the world in patterns others missed. The town had called him eccentric. Elias called him a genius. The plan was in those journals, a structure dug into the south-facing slope of the hill, 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. A pit house, a winter greenhouse, a place, his grandfather had written, that could borrow the earth's deep warmth and steal the sun's thin light, a place that could hold a gentle summer temperature while a blizzard raged outside. A shelter. "You're digging your own grave, boy." The voice was rough, familiar. Elias stopped, leaning on his shovel handle. "Mister." Gable stood at the edge of the property line, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of weathered disapproval. He was a man who had survived 60 winters in this valley by following the old rules. Tall walls, a steep roof to shed the snow, and a mountain of firewood that could choke a bear. Elias nodded a greeting. "Mr. Gable." "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen," Gable continued, gesturing with his chin at the shallow trench. "The ground will freeze 6 feet deep come January. What are you planning to do then? You'll have a trench full of ice and pneumonia for your trouble." "It'll be covered by then," Elias said. His voice was quiet, unused. "Covered with what? Snow? That hole will be a drift fence. It'll fill up to the top in the first storm, and you'll not find it again till May." He shook his head, a gesture of profound pity. "Your father was a sensible man. He knew how to prepare for a winter. This is foolishness." "I have a plan," Elias said, his gaze returning to the earth at his feet. Gable snorted. "A plan? Wait until winter. Winter will show you your plan." He turned and walked away, his heavy boots crushing the dry grass. Barrow watched him go, then looked back at Elias, tilting his head. Elias reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears. The fur was warm from the sun. He picked up the shovel. The work was the only answer he had. Weeks passed. The trench deepened. The sun beat down on his back, and the muscles in his arms and shoulders burned with a constant, satisfying ache. He worked from dawn until the light failed, stopping only to eat cold bread and jerky, sharing pieces with Barrow, who lay faithfully at the trench's edge. The pile of excavated earth became a small mountain. He used a wheelbarrow, a rickety thing with a squeaking wheel, to haul the dirt to the north side of the pit, forming a thick berm that would deflect the prevailing winter winds. Each load was a trial, a slow, straining journey up the slight incline. The physical toll was immense. His hands, already calloused from farm work, blistered, broke open, and bled. He would clean them at night in cold water, wrapping them in strips of cloth, and by morning they would be stiff and sore, but ready to grip the shovel again. The town watched. Mrs. Gable brought him a jar of stew one evening, her face etched with a worry that was almost as sharp as her husband's scorn. "Elias, you're getting too thin. This obsession, it isn't healthy. There's a room for you in town if you need it. You don't have to stay out here alone." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," he said, accepting the stew. "But this is my home." She looked at the yawning pit, at the raw, exposed earth. "This isn't a home, child. It's a hole in the ground." Even Mr. Sterling, the man who owned the timber mill and half the town, took notice. He would ride by on his fine horse, a condescending smile on his face. He saw the project not as a tragedy, but as an amusement. "Still at it, Thorne?" he called out one day. "Taking a shortcut to China, are we?" His laughter carried on the wind long after he had passed. Only one person looked at his work without judgment. Lena, the storekeeper's daughter, would sometimes walk up the path on her way to gather herbs in the high meadows. She was quiet like him, with a steady, observant gaze. The first time she stopped, she didn't ask what he was doing, but how. "That stone," she said, pointing to the creek bed where he was prying loose, flat, gray slabs of granite. "It must be heavy." "It is," he said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty forearm. "What is it for?" she asked, her curiosity genuine. "For the walls, to hold the heat." She looked from the stones to the deep trench. She saw the careful slope of the walls, the precise angles he was cutting. She saw the logic in the labor. "My father said you were being foolish." "Most people think so." "I don't," she said simply. She watched for a few more minutes, then continued on her way. Her brief visit was a small pocket of warmth in a day of hard labor, a quiet counterpoint to the chorus of doubt that echoed from the town below. By the first frost, the pit was complete. 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, sloping from a depth of 8 feet at the back to 6 feet at the front. He had spent the last month lining the back and side walls with the stones he'd hauled from the creek. It was slow, brutal work. He had no mortar, only a deep understanding of gravity and friction learned from his grandfather's notes. He fit the stones together like a puzzle, the largest at the bottom, the smaller ones filling the gaps, creating a solid, stable wall of thermal mass that would absorb the Earth's constant 55-degree temperature. Barrow would often lie inside the half-finished structure, finding the cool earth a relief from the late autumn sun. Then came the timber. He went into his woodlot, a stand of pine and fir his father had managed with care. He selected 20 straight, strong trees, each about 10 inches in diameter. He felled them with an axe and a two-man saw he operated alone, a grueling process of sweat and swearing. He notched the logs with painstaking precision, using old techniques from the journals, creating joints that would lock together without a single nail. He dragged the logs to the site with a rope and his own brute strength, Barrow trotting alongside as if offering encouragement. He built the roof frame directly over the pit, a heavy ridgeline beam supported by 3 massive posts set deep into the pit floor. Rafters sloped down from the ridgeline to the front and back walls. The entire north-facing slope of the roof was designed to be buried in earth, while the south-facing slope was a different matter entirely. It was a wide, open frame, angled precisely, according to his grandfather's charts, to catch the maximum amount of winter sunlight. This was the part that earned him the most ridicule. "A glass roof?" Gable had bellowed, seeing the frame. "In a hailstorm? You're a bigger fool than I thought. The first heavy snow will shatter it to pieces if the wind doesn't take it first." Elias didn't argue. He just kept working. He bought dozens of old window sashes from a salvage yard in the next county, spending nearly all the money his parents had left him. He spent a week reglazing them, replacing cracked panes, sealing them with putty until they were airtight. Then, with an ingenious system of ropes and levers, he hauled them into place, fastening them to the south-facing rafters. He built a wall of glass and wood that tilted toward the pale sun. The final step was to cover the rest of the structure. He laid thick planks over the northern rafters, followed by a layer of oilcloth for waterproofing. Then, for 2 weeks, he moved the mountain of excavated earth back onto the structure. He shoveled and hauled until the roof and the earthen berm blended seamlessly into the hillside. From the north, his shelter was nearly invisible, just a gentle swelling of the land. From the south, it was a wall of glass that glittered in the low sun. A small insulated door and a stone chimney pipe were the only other clues to its existence. Inside, it was a different world. It smelled of damp earth, pine wood, and curing stone. A small, efficient wood stove stood against the back wall, its pipe venting through the chimney. He built a simple cot, a table, and shelves into the earthen walls. It was a cave, a den, a womb. It was home. As the first snows began to fall, dusting the mountains with white, the temperature inside the shelter, without any fire, held steady. He used an old thermometer nailed to a post. Outside, it might be 30 degrees. Inside, it was 52. The earth was breathing its warmth into the space. The sun, when it shone, would stream through the glass, and the temperature would climb to nearly 70. The stone walls and the packed earth floor would soak up that heat and release it slowly through the long, cold night. He moved his supplies in: sacks of flour and beans, dried meats, crates of potatoes and carrots from his root cellar. He stacked firewood neatly by the stove, though his calculations suggested he would need less than a quarter of what a traditional cabin required. Barrow claimed a spot on a braided rug by the hearth and seemed to approve. The townspeople saw his final preparations and gave their final warnings. "That glass will be a sheet of ice by morning," Sterling declared to the men at the general store. "The boy will freeze in his own ridiculous root cellar." Lena was the only one who came to see it finished. She stood at the doorway looking in. The air was still and cool, but not cold. A single sunbeam cut through the space, illuminating dust motes in a golden shaft. "It's peaceful," she said. "It's quiet," he agreed. She looked at him, at the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the new strength in his shoulders. "You did it." "I did," he said. And in that simple exchange, he felt a sense of vindication more powerful than any argument he could have made. He had not built it to prove them wrong. He had built it to survive. But her belief was a small, warm fire against the coming cold. The wind was picking up, moaning through the pines. The sky had turned the color of lead. Winter was no longer waiting. It was here. The first month of winter was a series of tests. Small storms blew through, dropping a few inches of snow at a time. The shelter performed as the journals predicted. The snow that fell on the glass would melt in the midday sun and run off. The snow that covered the earthen roof acted as another layer of insulation, deepening the silence, locking in the warmth. Elias would burn a small fire in the stove for a few hours in the evening, enough to cook his meal and raise the temperature to a comfortable 68 degrees. By morning, it would have dropped only to 60. He and Barrow lived in a pocket of perpetual autumn, while the world outside hardened into winter's unforgiving grip. He spent his days reading, mending his tools, and carving small wooden figures of animals. He watched the deer and foxes move through the snow-covered landscape, their tracks telling stories on the white canvas. He felt a deep sense of peace, a connection to the cycles of the season that he had never known in the drafty cabin. He was not fighting the winter, he was living within it. The talk in town, however, persisted. They saw no smoke from his chimney for long stretches and assumed the worst. Mrs. Gable worried herself sick, certain he had frozen to death. Mr. Gable, though he would never admit it, felt a nagging unease. Foolishness was one thing, but he had not wished the boy harm. Then came the signs. The old-timers felt it in their bones, a deep, aching cold that signaled something more than a simple storm. The sky stayed a flat, milky white for 3 days straight. The air grew unnaturally still, the temperature dropping steadily. Animals disappeared, gone to their dens and burrows. An old trapper came down from the mountains, his face grim. "Never seen the like," he told the men at the store. "The wind up high, it's screaming. Something wicked is coming." They called it the White Hurricane. It began not with snow, but with wind. A low moan that grew into a shriek, a physical force that rattled the windows of the town's sturdy cabins and tore at the roofs. The temperature plummeted, 20 below, 30 below, then 40 below zero. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Then the snow came, not falling but driven horizontally, a blinding, scouring blizzard that erased the world. Inside his shelter, Elias heard the wind as a distant, muffled roar. The structure was part of the hill, and the wind flowed over it. The weight of the snow on the roof was immense, but the heavy log beams were designed to hold it. He had built a small fire, and the inside was warm and bright. The thermometer read 65 degrees. He sat at his table, reading one of his grandfather's books, while Barrow slept soundly on the rug, twitching in a dream of chasing rabbits. The contrast was absolute. Outside, a world of lethal, chaotic violence. Inside, a small circle of profound peace and warmth. For 2 days, the storm raged without pause. The snow piled up, burying fences, swallowing sheds. Drifts climbed to the eaves of the houses in town. The world was reduced to the howling of the wind and the suffocating whiteness. Elias kept his routine. He ate, read, tended the small fire. He felt no fear, only a deep, quiet gratitude for the yellowed pages in his grandfather's journals. On the morning of the 3rd day, a new sound cut through the muffled roar of the wind. A frantic, desperate pounding. It wasn't at his door. The door was buried under 10 feet of snow. It was on the glass of the south-facing wall. Elias grabbed a shovel. Barrow was on his feet, a low growl in his throat. Elias could see dark shapes through the snow-plastered glass. He unlatched the door and pushed, but it wouldn't budge. The snow was packed like concrete against it. He started digging from the inside out, shoveling the snow into a corner of the shelter. It was like digging a tunnel. After 20 minutes of frantic work, he broke through. A figure, covered in snow, his face rimed with ice, fell into the opening. It was Mr. Gable. His wife was right behind him, sobbing, her face pale with cold and fear. "Elias," Gable gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. "Help us, please." Elias pulled them inside into the warmth. They stumbled in, their eyes wide with disbelief. They stared at the thermometer on the post, at the calm dog, at Elias in his simple wool shirt. They had been fighting for their lives in a world of 40 below. Here, it was 65 degrees. "The roof," Gable stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "The weight of the snow, it just came down. The whole north side of the house. Gone. The fire went out. We thought we were going to die." Elias gave Mrs. Gable a blanket and a mug of hot tea. He helped her husband out of his frozen coat. There was no triumph in his eyes, only compassion. "You're safe now," he said. They were not the last. An hour later, more pounding. It was the Sterlings. Their fine two-story house with its big glass windows had been no match for the hurricane. The wind had blown out every north-facing window, and their furnace had failed. They arrived half frozen, their arrogance stripped away, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. Mr. Sterling, the man who had mocked him relentlessly, could not meet his eyes. He huddled by the stove, shivering, humbled. By nightfall, 17 people were sheltered in Elias's burrow, the families from the 3 nearest homesteads. They sat on the floor, on crates, on the edge of his cot. The small space was crowded but warm, a human island in the middle of a frozen sea. They shared his food, his water, the impossible warmth of his ridiculous hole in the ground. The storm raged for another full day. Inside the shelter, a strange community formed. Fear gave way to awe, and awe to a quiet gratitude. They listened to the wind howling over them, a sound that would have meant death just hours before, and felt only security. Mr. Gable sat staring at the stone wall, his hand resting on its cool, solid surface. "All this time," he said, his voice thick with emotion, speaking to no one in particular. "It was right here. The warmth was in the earth all along." He finally looked at Elias, his eyes clear and direct. "I was a fool, boy. I'm sorry. You saved our lives." Elias simply nodded. "It worked," he said. Lena and her family arrived the next morning, after the wind had finally begun to die down. The roof of the general store had been damaged, and their living quarters were freezing. When she saw the small crowd of people safe inside the shelter, her eyes met Elias's across the room. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression was a mixture of relief, pride, and a deep, abiding respect that felt warmer than any fire. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, the world was transformed. It was a landscape of alien beauty and utter devastation. The sun shone on a world buried in white. The town was crippled. Roofs had collapsed, livestock had frozen in the fields, and stores of firewood were buried under impassable drifts. But the 17 people in Elias's shelter were alive and well. The story of the underground shelter spread through the valley like wildfire. It was no longer Elias's folly. It was the miracle burrow. People came to see it, to stand inside and feel the impossible warmth for themselves. They looked at the elegant simplicity of its design, the way it blended with the land, the way it used the very elements they fought against, the earth, the snow, the sun, to create a haven of safety. They came to Elias not with scorn, but with questions. They brought him broken tools to thank him, offering to mend them in exchange for his knowledge. They brought pies and smoked hams and sacks of grain. Mr. Sterling, his fortune diminished by the storm's damage to his mill, came with a crew of his remaining men. "Thorne," he said, his voice stripped of its usual condescension. "Show us how. We'll provide the labor, the timber. Just show us what to do." Elias did not lecture. He did not boast. He simply unrolled his grandfather's journals on the table, the pages worn and soft as cloth. He pointed to the diagrams, to the calculations of solar angles and thermal mass. He walked with them to their own land, showed them how to read the slopes, how to find the best placement. He taught them how to notch logs, how to lay stone without mortar, how to build not against the winter, but with it. That spring and summer, the valley was filled with the sounds of digging and building. Men who had once mocked him now worked alongside him, learning his quiet, deliberate rhythms. Gable was his most dedicated student, his earlier skepticism replaced by the zeal of a convert. "The earth provides," he would tell newcomers, echoing a phrase he'd heard Elias use. "You just have to be smart enough to ask it right." Lena was a constant presence. She would bring him lunch, but more often she came to work, her hands growing calloused alongside his as she helped mix clay for sealing the new structures. Their conversations were sparse, but their understanding was complete. They were building more than shelters. They were rebuilding a community, and in the process, they were building a life together. By the time the snows returned, there were 7 new shelters dug into the hillsides of the valley. They were not identical copies of his own. Each was adapted to its specific location, a testament to the principles, not just the design, that he had shared. When the first big storm of that winter hit, no one was afraid. The families gathered in their warm, quiet burrows, safe and secure, and lit a lamp in their south-facing windows, a signal to their neighbors. Looking out from his own shelter, Elias could see the small points of light glowing across the valley, a constellation of shared hope and hard-won wisdom. Years passed. The seasons turned, each one deepening the roots of the community. The underground shelters became the valley's signature, a symbol of its resilience. Elias and Lena married in the high meadow, on the grassy roof of the home he had built. Their children were born there, and their first steps were taken on the warm earth floor. Barrow, who had been the project's first and most loyal witness, grew old, his muzzle turning white, his amber eyes clouded with age. He spent his days sleeping on the rug by the stove, his presence a comforting link to the past. The valley prospered. The knowledge of the shelters spread, carried by travelers and traders. People would come to learn from Elias, who was no longer the strange, solitary boy, but a respected elder. He never saw himself as a leader. He was a keeper of knowledge, a conduit for his grandfather's quiet genius. He taught the children of the men who had once mocked him, showing them how to patch the waterproofing on the roofs, how to reglaze the windows, how to listen to the language of the land. One clear, cold morning in the shelter's 15th winter, Barrow did not wake up. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, curled in his favorite spot. Elias carried the dog's stiff body, wrapped in a blanket, up the hill, and buried him under the lone pine where he had so often watched the digging. He carved a simple stone marker. Barrow. He knew. Lena stood with him, her hand on his arm, sharing the silent grief. The dog's passing was a quiet turning of a page, the end of the first chapter of his new life. It marked the passage of time in a way that the changing seasons could not. More years spun by. Elias's hair turned the color of winter frost. His hands, though still strong, were gnarled with arthritis. He walked with a slight stoop, the legacy of 1,000 heavy stones and logs. He and Lena watched their children grow and build shelters of their own, their laughter echoing in the warm, earthen spaces. Mr. and Mrs. Gable were gone, and so was Mr. Sterling, all of them laid to rest in the town cemetery. Before he died, Gable had taken Elias's hand. "Thank you, son," he had said. "You taught an old fool how to see." Elias lived to be a very old man. He saw the world change in ways he could barely comprehend. But in the valley, the fundamental truths remained. The sun still cast its low arc in the winter, and the earth still held its deep, steady warmth. The shelters endured, their grassy roofs greening every spring, their glass walls glittering in the sun. They had become as much a part of the landscape as the pines and the river. On a late autumn evening, with the scent of snow in the air, Elias sat in his chair, his grandfather's journals open on his lap. He looked at the familiar diagrams, the elegant script. He had lived the life the journals had promised. He felt Lena's hand on his shoulder. He smiled, closed his eyes, and drifted into a sleep from which he would not wake. The entire valley came to his funeral. They buried him on the hill beside his faithful dog, overlooking the home that had saved them all. They did not mourn his passing so much as celebrate his life, telling stories of the great blizzard, of the quiet, stubborn boy who dug a hole while everyone else laughed. They placed a simple stone beside his grave, carved by the grandson of Mr. Gable. It did not list dates or accomplishments. It said only, "Elias Thorne. He taught us to listen to the earth." Decades later, long after the last person who remembered his face was gone, the original shelter remained. The town maintained it as a monument, a touchstone. School children would visit on field trips, their voices echoing in the space as they learned the story. They would place their hands on the stone walls and feel the faint, constant warmth. They would look at the thermometer, a newer model now, but hanging in the same spot, and see that even as a winter wind howled across the meadow outside, the air inside remained calm and gentle. The shelter stood, a quiet testament to the boy who had trusted the earth, a legacy not of stone and wood, but of warmth, of safety, and of a wisdom that had been patiently waiting, just beneath the surface, to be discovered.